G'day folks, and welcome back to part 2 of this conversation with Kendal Whitlock, a leader and change maker who is working to increase the effectiveness of clinical trials while also improving access, representation, and the patient experience. In this episode, we'll go a little further into her work to bring clinical trial information into people's hands where they reside. Thank you.
So that's how I entered industry. And my job was a medical science liaison. And I was tasked with going and speaking with thought leaders and inquiring from them, what are your educational needs for your fellows and for those in training? What are your research interests and what are the research hypotheses that maybe the industry can help support through medical education and research grants? So investigator-initiated trials and continuing medical education became my world. And it wasn't like working. It was just the life I wanted to live. It was the conversations I wanted to have. 60% of the job was studying the medical literature and having conversations about the science. And so I didn't have a physical science degree. So even the companies that I worked for sent me out to do additional training so that I could learn what pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and be able to carry a conversation, a scientific exchange with someone who's practiced for 25 years and the industry deems to be the most important person on the subject. So for me to carry myself in that context, I needed to be able to have a conversation where they felt I was a link to getting what they needed for the research that they wanted to do. And it was wonderful.
It's a cool feeling, isn't it? Having those conversations and knowing that while you may not have their depth of knowledge, right, you're at least holding a real genuine conversation.
Right. And I didn't need to be them. I didn't need to have that depth and breadth. What I needed to be was a pathway for them to say, 25% of my patients don't respond to the therapy that I would think that they would, and I don't know why. It's a mystery. Some of the patients just don't respond. So they would hypothesize, they would come up with investigator-initiated study protocols, and that was what I negotiated internally to get those projects funded to satisfy that unmet need, that why aren't a segment of your patients responding the way that you think they should? And so I felt I was really almost, helping them. I felt like I worked for them as much as I worked for the company. Yep. We needed people who needed to have experience with the molecules that were in development, and they needed answers to their clinical questions. So, it's just the liaison.
Part of that then leads to inequity, right? And under representation of certain populations within clinical trials. So that is the answer to some of the why do we have non-responders? Yes. Want to talk about your impact there?
Yes, I have heard this topic since 1998, I think. When you were in primary school. Right. We can cut that part out too, right? I don't have to spill all the tea. So while I was at Forest and I had an antihypertensive in development, I had a number of cardiologists who were my thought leaders. And when I met with some, they were the ones who were having the most difficulty, the patients that just didn't respond. They saw the package insert, they knew the science, but for some reason, certain patients were just not responding to medication the way that they thought. And there were medical meetings, there were publications about angioedema with certain drugs or just different side effects that subsets of populations had. And so that experience of having that unexpected adverse event eroded the trust that the patient populations had in that molecule or in just medicine in general, because to some patient populations, if the medication doesn't work that your doc gave you, then you can shrug your shoulders and wonder, well, what will work for me? Why doesn't it work for me? Where, if this is what you're recommending, why isn't it working? So that affects the trust equation as well. And so one of the first grants that I saw funded that addressed the issue. So I had a project, I should take a step back. I had a pet project, a side project outside of my job, which was I was doing a needs assessment on the issue of underrepresentation in clinical trials when I was still in the medical education group. And I had the authority to do that from my management. So here's actual practice and here's what practice should be. And that variance is what the education is aiming to bridge, right? So that's why industry funds independent medical education grants. And I said, well, why aren't we addressing the inequity within the drug development? So the senior vice president of medicine was my mentor/sponsor. He's an incredible person, Dr. Chris Corsico. And he said, I bet you if you get the money from the therapeutic areas, I'll match it. Oh, game on. Challenge accepted. So I went and basically to every single one of his vice presidents of every therapeutic area. And I said, if we carve out a piece of your budget to address the inequity within the disease, I think that we can amplify what people understand. Some people don't even know there's inequities in patient populations, especially if you don't treat those patients. And what if more patients would benefit from the drug, and therefore everybody wins. The patients win, the provider wins, and we win. And they did it. They gave an allocation from certain therapeutic areas. And so the outcome of it was that one of the grants that was approved, again, these are independent medical education grants, was the inaugural symposium for the Elijah Saunders lecture on improving diversity in clinical trials. And Elijah Saunders was my mentor when I started in industry. So for me, this was a full circle moment because Dr. Saunders was somebody who would invite me to meetings that were closed door meetings to say, look, just sit down and be quiet and learn. just learn. You're my niece. Just sit down and learn. And in part because there weren't a lot of people in my shoes in that role who were people of color. And so in industry at that time, the MSL role was a highly coveted role. So even not having a terminal degree in that role was out of step with the way that role recruited. But because I was always on my soapbox and because I absorbed the science, I was able to conduct business and carry out my job successfully year over year for years. But Dr. Saunders was somebody who was instrumental in helping to move this needle on inequity.
Another one, again, another impact of a mentor along the way. Now,
absolutely.
The reason that they're being willing to mentor you is because of the drive, right, that comes through in this discussion.
I do want to point one thing out in those mentors that I've mentioned so far. Chris Corsico is not a man of color, but Chris Corsico, in being the senior vice president, he was also the country head. So he was the most important person in our organization. And I was the chair of the African Heritage Business Resource Group. And he was the sponsor. Many of the senior leaders are sponsors of the business resource groups or employee resource groups, or like affinity groups. And we hosted an event, my first year in that role, that had higher attendance and more receptivity from the organization than they had ever seen from the African Heritage Business Resource Group. And Dr. Corsico called me into his office and he said, look, I want you to meet with every single one of my vice presidents. You tell them what you want to do. Whether you need to do this job or that career, you let them know what your goals are. So mentors can be anyone.
Absolutely. But again, it's not one way. Mentorship is a two-way street. Yeah. All right. So then what made you leave that now to your current role? I know there was a couple of steps along the way.
Sure.
But why? Why leave that now to where you are now? And people would have heard in the beginning.
Right.
Walgreens.
Right. So my former employer, a family-owned business, 130 plus years old. I worked in different departments over my tenure, over 13 years. It's a family-owned company. It was like family in many ways. In December of last year, my mom fell ill unexpectedly and literally overnight. She was fine one day. We were on vacation visiting my godmother. And one day she just, the next morning, not talking and barely able to walk, stayed in the bed the entire day. And I told my godmother, I said, I can't drive us home with her in this condition. I need to know what's going on. And we went to the emergency room, stayed in the emergency room. They said, we're finding nothing that we can explain. You need to go to a larger, more comprehensive hospital to get this checked out, but please get there now. So got her back to New Jersey. When we got to the hospital, she was admitted for a week. She had a UTI. And in her age group, a UTI presents like a transient ischemic attack or like a stroke. And so she completely shut down, could not walk, could not talk, could not toilet, could not do anything herself. And was, could not communicate, and what she was communicating was not clear. As I mentioned, my parents are my besties. They are. And our organization was going through, that version of this year's transformation had been going on for quite some time. And we were all going to be dispersed into new roles with the transformation. And I know me well enough to know, if I start something new, I need to give it 100+% at the beginning, full steam ahead. In that situation, at that moment, I knew if I took that opportunity to go forward into the next iteration of the medical affairs division, I would have to let my foot off the gas at home. And I wasn't willing to do that. And I needed to have that kind of come to Jesus moment for myself to say, like, is this really happening? Like, you're gonna really just say no, and this is gonna draw the line in the sand. But I know me well enough to know that if I had taken on the yes and gone forward, I could have lived with regret, not knowing what was happening at home or how it was going to play out in the end. And so I gracefully said, I gotta go, and thank you, and I'm out. And my mom went for another 2 weeks of acute care. So I'm happy to report my mom goes to belly dancing classes one day a week, and she goes to art painting classes one day a week. And you can't stop her from telling you what is happening in the New York Times, which is her thing, and debating, anything political, because that is where, is her sweet spot, it's her joy, where she's just going to have a rigorous conversation with anybody who will talk to her, even if it's the person online at the grocery store.
Any regrets with the choice? Doesn't look like it.
Zero. I mean, I can't look backwards. I had an incredible time over the last 13 years. I had an incredible experience. I had exposure, leadership development programs, traveled to India to work with women's self-help groups, which is part of the corporate social responsibility activities, and being able to learn from leaders in all facets of life in different corners of the globe. And so my learnings are with me, my experience goes with me. And in the beginning of this year, someone asked, hey, there's this lady who's always talking about the same thing you're always talking about. You should meet. Now, the person who asked me that is not a really personal bestie. It's just someone who knows what I'm into. And I couldn't believe there was another person who was the same person who's got 7 out of the 9 KPIs is her life. And that's my boss now. And so
And who's that?
Ramita Tandon, who is the Chief Trials Officer for the Walgreens Real-World Evidence Clinical Trials business. If you could just hear her for a minute, I mean, she has you at hello, because she presents to you why this is important. And why this is important is because there are inequities that we can solve. There don't have to be certain inequities. It's just like prevention. The leading causes of death. You think about cardiovascular disease, number 1 cause of death, and think about how much of it is preventable. 100% preventable, not a percentage preventable, but it's 100%. So why can't we say, let's commit to reducing inequity because it's solvable? And there was a recent report she talks about, just evaluating the progress in industry of how well they are addressing inequities and health disparities. And there's a scorecard. And a lot of organizations have work to do. There is a developmental opportunity that I think that many have looked at for quite some time that hasn't been solved yet.
So you're differentiating between industry being pharma, med tech, biotech, I guess.
Medical device.
Medical device. But the job now is Walgreens. Why Walgreens? I mean, why this role that you're talking about? 100% agree. How does Walgreens play a role in this?
Right. So as I was introduced to who is now my boss, Ramita Tandon, she educated me about what Walgreens' vision was to transform from being a retail pharmacy, where you go in the store, you get your medication, and that's the reason you're in the store, to becoming a healthcare company. So there are strategic partnerships. Roz Brewer, our CEO, I don't know if you've watched her career, but I have been watching Roz Brewer's career for quite some time. And to hear her describe the vision that she has in the partnerships, the strategic partners that she's bringing in for us. Village MD brings us primary care medical service providers. A lot of people don't have primary care, access to primary care. Village MD just bought Summit Health. So we've expanded our primary care presence. And in communities across this country, there are 9,000 Walgreens stores. Almost 7,000 of them have a private health room. So suddenly going to your local Walgreens store, 78% of Americans are within 5 miles of a Walgreens store. That means that one of the barriers that we in industry have talked about for decades of the distance to clinical trial sites being a barrier to participation, cross that off the list, because guess what? If we are proximate to where people are, then we can bring research to people where they live. And that is game changing. So for the vision of saying we're going from being a retail pharmacy in the traditional model to being a healthcare company where we have care centrics. If a person who cannot get to a physical store can have that service provided to them in their home, then guess what? That person has access to care. If we have other relationships, digital relationships, for example, tech partner relationships that enable us to do a decentralized clinical trial, then through a decentralized clinical trial, a person doesn't have to physically go to the site for every single study visit if the protocol warrants it, and if it's a visit that can be done through something like a local Walgreens, then they have a private health room in which to do that study visit. And that is a convenience to that patient, because guess what? They might go to work during the day and a traditional clinical trial site might be closed when they get off work. So even if they were willing to participate, the convenience of scheduling would be a barrier to them if they can't do it in the time that's convenient for them to participate. Another partner we have is a technology partner. And with that technology partner, we marry our incredible pharmacy footprint of pharmacy records to EMR data. So we are now able to educate patients more than just the prescription that they are filling. We are able to give them a wraparound view of things that they could do to take action on in their health. That is going to improve the health of people and communities. So under the leadership of Roz Brewer and of Ramita Tandon, I have the privilege of working differently on the same problems that I have cared about for almost 30 years. And others have been in this conversation, but I can't tell you the flood of interest that a Walgreens being in this conversation. People can't stop asking us how we can work together on solving this problem, because I think people now see the solution is right in front of our eyes.
So it breaks into two areas, right? So there's clinical trials, and then sort of more access to the population, in general, right. Sort of post clinical trial, when we're selling and distributing. But go back to the beginning, right? So during the clinical trials.
Well, if we look at, in this country, if we look at the cross-section by race and ethnicity, and we think, okay, African Americans make up 13.6% of the population, but are only represented in 5% of trials. If we look at oncology as a therapeutic area, well, maybe oncology patients across different tumor types and hematologic malignancies make up a disproportionately higher percentage of people with mortality from cancers, but only make up 1% of the trial participants. Then how will we know if medications are proven safe and effective for all patients to take? And if you don't find that information out when the trial is in development, then when the drug is approved, the provider does not have that data behind them, that confidence that that molecule is going to be effective and safe in the patient that they're prescribing it to. And that's not the time to learn whether or not drugs are safe.
So I agree, right? And so I think we're all well aware of the underrepresentation. And so the way, as a person who's been doing clinical studies for a while, we pick locations. We will pick certain areas to make sure that we're getting a reasonable spread, a reasonable range of diversity. But I think something that's really different here is there's still, I'm saying, okay, if we're Atlanta, so this is everywhere, right? This is the difference, right? And so I'm seeing tremendous value from this, after we've been doing the research for today, in patient recruitment. And so every Walgreens, or every pharmacy, but we're focused on Walgreens at the moment. Right. Is that the vision?
Our business started officially in June of last year, and there are 3 service lines. Patient recruitment is the largest of the 3 service lines. Decentralized clinical trials, again, being able to have hybrid decentralized, where some study visits are done in a physical brick and mortar site, some study visits are done at home, and then real world evidence. And that piece of it, real world evidence, being able to look at our data assets and find ways to see patient populations differently and approach patients in a more personalized manner. Not this bolus of let's just send emails to everybody. Because guess what? A lot of adult children of older adults will sign their parents up for an account with an email that they've created. But does that mean an 88-year-old is routinely checking their email and would respond just because they're eligible for a clinical trial? Maybe not. Yep. So using the analytics and that power, we are developing a tool so we can, within a very short space of time, an hour maybe at the most, to be able to tell a sponsor how many eligible patients we have available to them to recruit for a trial in a manner that is more precise than what is currently being done.
Yeah, that's game changing. Yeah. Same word at the same time, right? I totally agree with you there. Mm-hmm. I think that our clinical trial model is somewhat flawed. Mm-hmm. And I don't just mean for underrepresentation across the board. Yeah. I think this is an incredibly expensive component of any startup. This could be good. FDA is doing a lot of work on real world evidence. Are you guys engaging with them?
We are through a variety of channels, but we have collaborative community, the MedTech Color. I don't know how much, we haven't talked yet about the MedTech Color collaborative community, but this has FDA contributing partners that are members of the subcommittee for product development, where I'm a chair of product development and clinical research for MedTech Color's collaborative community. There are a number of relationships and discussions underway, but in fact, Ramita is going to be in Washington later this week, participating in a virtual discussion with Rob Califf, for example, and others on emergency preparedness. So if we think about the experience that Walgreens learned from the millions who came to Walgreens and got their shot. Now, these are historically from communities that are marginalized and those that are socially vulnerable. So if industry tends to articulate that these are difficult patients for industry to recruit, they are harder to reach. Well, these are communities that came to Walgreens where there was no barrier to them getting vaccinated. And so we want to leverage that learning that communities will come to where they think and can get a shot in the arm. Then what if there's another pandemic? What if we need to understand what barriers or thoughts people have about clinical trial participation in the context of vaccine development? Then we should have that mapped out so that any community, anyone who understands enough about a clinical trial will learn how to gain access to a clinical trial. And so this is an effort to ensure that Americans have a preparedness in the context of clinical trials for the what if there's another pandemic. So that should be a very interesting discussion.
It is. It's the reach that you guys offer. It's remarkable. Yeah.
And the understanding. I think Walgreens has understood more about patients and the retail pharmacy generally. I mean, there's more touch points than a primary care doctor who may see a patient once a year for an annual exam. But with a retail pharmacy, patients are usually in that pharmacy setting monthly. And so there's more opportunity for education and for retail pharmacies to learn what the needs are from communities themselves. They can speak for themselves.
All right, got to ask this one because, again, in doing the homework, but this seemed to resonate with you. And this is not an ad for Walgreens, but more joyful lives through better health. That seemed to resonate with you beyond the fact that it's the company you're working with. Why?
It does.
What interests that?
There's so much about that because that word joy is not something that I think people can fake. There's a mantra of, fake it till you make it. And people can say, oh, we'll just smile. And, people have distress behind a smile. But joy is not the same thing. Joy is one of those feelings that's from inside that shows on the outside that people will recognize when they see it. And so for that to be our North Star, it orients us to how to build strategies around what the outcome is supposed to look like. It is what comes from people that they're not faking. They actually do feel better. They may function better. Sometimes people's diagnoses and their condition leaves them, cuts them off from that aspiration of feeling that good. Not just getting better, but having joy.
Joy.
That's different.
Good.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. Now, this is a little bit about you. In the discussion that we had before, you described a technique for when you were down, that of how you recover from being down, and where all of us are going to be down, and sometimes significantly down in our lives. Yeah. What was your technique?
My technique was, it was born out of necessity. I was getting divorced, and it was a difficult time. But I found that helping other people helps you take your mind off of whatever you're ruminating about and immediately reframes the possibility of a better experience for you tomorrow. And I think that a lot of people that I've spoken with, coaches and just older adults who have experienced a lot more than I have a lot of experience in the end being better. So taking cues from the elders and learning from them is also essential. But more importantly, seeing someone else's difficulty eliminated.
Yeah, helping them to do that.
Helping them to do that and being sort of the facilitator so that their lives are improved, so that their attitude about their lives is improved.
Every successful career has a failure or two along the way.
Certainly.
Maybe you've been fortunate. Have you, and we're not here to talk about the failures, but I'm assuming you have. How did you get through?
It's a great question. It's a difficult question as well. The failures are necessary, but somewhere along the lines, I think it was probably in graduate school when I first read that you learn more from failures than you do from the things that you do successfully. And so taking that lens, a failure for me means, what exactly is it that I'm trying to do? What exactly do I want to do? And focusing my energy on what it is that I'm trying to do and what it is that I'm hoping for, not what happened in the past. Because we can analyze and overanalyze about a past failure, but a failure is a fact, and we can make two choices at that time. We can choose to stay in the stew of the fact that there was a failure, or we can take a step in a different direction to say, what do you want to do? How do you want to do it? Who do you want to be? And just start again. Literally, that first step. It's the hardest step, but it's the first step to saying, I'm committing to having better. I'm committing to a better reality than that. But the learning is important to take forward.
And I think that's the key, right? So look, in our industry, in medtech, med device, like you were saying, startup world, there are lots of failures along the way, and we prefer to call them lessons.
Right.
And I think if you approach them as a lesson, and you get something positive out of that, no longer a failure.
Right.
But again,
it's an integral part of the process.
It's part of the process, totally.
Yeah. As a child, I was afraid of failure. I felt like the stakes were too high. I never wanted to fail, and that sets you up for this, perfectionism, which we know is a disaster. Is a disaster. So
I think it's really important to embrace that it's okay.
Yeah.
It's not okay to repeatedly do the same stupid thing, but it's okay to actually, to make a decision that doesn't work out occasionally.
Right, absolutely.
All right, so now looking back, hopefully, there's a couple of folks there that are at the early stage of their career. What lessons, what would you like to leave them with today? What's word of wisdom?
Lesson learned. So I think being true to what's really inside, not just what you've built up over the things that you've done, because we build up a lot of experience. And sometimes the experiences we have are because the influences we had early on were the things of what people told us we should do. And so you sometimes early in career have a lot of experiences, and the conclusion is that's fine, and now you're an expert, but it might not be who you really want to be, or what you really want to do. So when I say be true to yourself, I don't mean it in a cliche. I mean really own you.
So how do you know that?
Well, I think
Who is you?
I think it's visceral. I think that you know when you are not showing up in your authentic expression of yourself. And you can choose to do that for whatever reasons one chooses to. But if you are not honoring that kernel, make it pop. Life is short. If I could leave the next generation with anything, it's just don't quit. Keep going. Don't let a failure stop you. My mom used to always, don't let one monkey stop your show. Call the monkey the failure. Don't let no monkey stop your show. So I would leave that with people to keep going, because after 13 years, even leaving a company that I treasured my work, great relationships, smart people, dedicated to the work that they're doing, didn't want to say goodbye, but saying goodbye at that moment was the best thing for me. And if I hadn't, I wouldn't have even known that better was possible. I hadn't contemplated this moment in my career. So this career move it's like a signature of the last 25 years of everything I've done led to right now. And so don't stop. Just keep going, but from inside.
Yep, beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think we leave it at that. Thank you. That was really great. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on MedTech Trailblazers. We hope you enjoy learning new things about another impact maker in our industry. Do join me again for future episodes in this series by subscribing to this podcast. Please also like and share our content with your colleagues. We'd also want to hear back from you with names of MedTech leaders you believe are trailblazers. Until next time, I'll leave you with my usual parting thought from Hannibal of Carthage that should resonate with all of us trying to make a difference for patients worldwide. And that is, I will either find a way or make one. Cheers.